Now we're going to turn things from Eric over to Andrew Shikiar, who's the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance, who I think will talk about work that's happening between government and industry to help transform the way we do authentication. Hopefully can provide some additional color on some of the themes that Eric just hit. So thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Jeremy, thanks so much. It is great to be here. And I'm actually flattered to follow Eric's opening comments, which are a great segue into our conversation today, which is about providing unphishable multi-factor authentication for everyone. I've spoken at this event the past few years. For those of you who have attended, this will provide you with updates on the substantial progress FIDO Alliance and the industry's made over the course of 2021. For those of you who are newer to FIDO, I hope this talk gives you a good feel for the imperative that FIDO is seeking to address, which fundamentally is the need not just for what I'll call check the box multi-factor authentication, but a truly unphishable foundation to secure a variety of connected services that are critical to today's networked society. Sadly, one thing I can always count on when giving this sort of presentation is a relevant and a recent example of a remote attack on sensitive resources. And sure enough, just last week, we saw a phishing attack on the Department of Labor. Elsewhere in the world, Singapore has been rocked by an SMS phishing scheme where hackers sent SMS messages that actually had phishing links to OCBC banking customers. The monetary authority of Singapore is now scrambling to implement new regulations on SMS-oriented banking communications, while thousands of customers are trying to recover tens of millions of dollars. And frankly, I could probably spend all 25 minutes today talking about recent examples of remote attacks. And to that end, I'm going to make some bold predictions for 2022. The first is not so bold, which is that phishing attacks will continue to succeed. Right? I think Eric, laid out how phishing works quite elegantly. But ultimately, phishing attacks will grow because they work, right? And phishers, in addition to causing chaos, like making money. Phishing attacks are relatively cheap to execute, and they have a staggering success rate, right? So a well-designed phishing attack, spear phishing attack, has over a 50% success rate. That's not a click rate, a success rate of someone actually getting phished. So with those odds and a little bit of investment, it's a quick way for hackers to take over accounts and make a couple bucks. But that's not really new. In fact, I could have made this precise prediction for the past several years and be batting 1,000. But my bolder prediction for 2022 is that MFA bypass attacks will become mainstream. And that's what Eric actually laid out in that diagram, showing how man-in-the-middle or relay attacks can actually enable this, fooling the legitimate site and the user alike into thinking that they're a legitimate interface to that site. This will become more and more normal, which we've already seen in 2022. What are we, 25 days into 2022? Two massive brands have suffered MFA bypass attacks on their customers, both EA and Crypto.com, costing tens of millions of virtual dollars. And the risk here is that people will kind of confuse these bypass attacks with more modern MFA, which is actually prevents phishing, as Eric talked about, as I'll detail further in my conversation today. So I think that's going to be something to watch in 2022 for certain. Now, there's also, it's not all doom and gloom. There's plenty of good news too. In general, I think there's more awareness of the inherent risk of passwords. And in fact, Gartner has, cited passwordless authentication as a now activity, encouraging enterprises to deploy passwordless this year, and citing FIDO and FIDO security keys as the preferred method. And I think this sort of guidance and this sort of awareness is one reason why, on an adjacent topic, it's one reason why we've seen so much venture capital investment going into the digital identity landscape. I know that our vendors and FIDO Alliance are as busy as can be, struggling to keep up with all the demand, which is certainly a great problem for them to have. So we'll see this space grow as we move forward into 2022, and beyond the enterprise. I'm going to predict that mobile platforms will provide consumer-ready solutions that can scale later this year. So basically enabling the promise of platform authenticators that Eric talked to, we already have today, but allowing that to scale even further through innovations in these device platforms. So stay tuned for more information from our stakeholders on that front later in 2022. But ultimately, a fundamental shift is required in the way that we authenticate. And Eric touched on some of this. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. We need to move from kind of knowledge-based credentialing to more modern possession-based credentialing. So knowledge-based stuff, of course, these are things and this is how we've always accessed online services. You put a password on the server. If you remember it and you enter it, you're granted access. Of course, a phisher could do the same thing. So knowledge-based authentication or passwords, anything that you know in your head, it's stored in a server. It can include OTP messages. A lot of the problem actually starts at account creation, identity proofing based on knowledge-based sources. And this is kind of the legacy means of credentialing and authentication that we need to move away from. The preferred approach is possession-based, right? Something in your hand, on your device. This can be your on-device biometric. This can be your local PIN. This also includes more modern ways of actually creating accounts, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The fundamental difference between these two things is that knowledge-based credentialing and knowledge-based authentication is susceptible to remote attacks and common threats, whereas modern authentication, modern MFA, possession-based authentication is truly phishing resistant. And that's the direction we need to head in, because ultimately, this check the box legacy MFA simply won't cut it for much longer. So if that's the approach the enterprise is taking, they're going to find themselves needing to upgrade their approach in the near future. And frankly, the legacy approach isn't really needed, as the availability and scalability of unphishable FIDO-based solutions continue to grow and be more prevalent on the market today. Backing up a little bit, FIDO's goal from day one has been to transform the way that the market authenticates users from a dependence on centrally stored shared secrets to a more decentralized model that allows users to authenticate through the devices that they literally have at their fingertips every day. It's simpler, stronger authentication, leveraging user-friendly, asymmetric public key cryptography. So the goal is to be both more secure and easier to use than passwords and legacy MFA, such as OTPs alike. FIDO's made great goal in creating these standards. We've released several sets of specifications since 2015, and the technologies have seen rapid adoption both in products and in real-world services, which continues to grow and scale every month of the year. A little bit about FIDO Alliance itself. We are an industry body. We have over 250 organizations taking part in FIDO Alliance. This is our board of directors, so over 40 companies, which really reflects the general composition of the FIDO Alliance membership itself, which is one reason why I think we've been able to have such a strong sense of collaboration and strong sense of accomplishment. We basically have three key constituencies in FIDO Alliance. First, we have the companies that create the platforms and devices that we all use every day, from chipsets on up to handsets. All those companies are involved in FIDO Alliance, invested in our efforts, and collaborating well within the organization. Secondly, we have experts in biometrics and identity, authentication, security. Both longtime stalwarts, companies who have been doing this for decades, as well as a host of really innovative, growth stage startup companies who are bringing fresh ideas into the mix. Then last but not least, we have the service providers whose businesses really rely on their ability to securely deliver services to billions of users worldwide. So these are the payment networks, the e-commerce providers, social media giants, the telcos, the banks, you name it. So they bring their requirements into the alliance, and then they collaborate with all the other members to build our specifications and our other outputs as well. Eric mentioned a couple of things earlier, spelled out a couple of requirements he wants to see, industry work on. That's what we're doing. And it's interesting to see his emphasis on usability. More and more, I find that I can't talk about FIDO, or you can't spell FIDO or authentication without talking about UX. And so we've invested a lot in that space as well, considering usability, considering inclusivity as we build out our specifications and related guidance as an organization. And overall, we're making good progress, as FIDO Alliance and as an industry. A couple of key data points, where we sit at the end of 2021. First, we have over 850 FIDO certified products. And I'm not going to get too deep into certification today because we're don't have enough time. But the FIDO certified program is an absolutely critical component of what FIDO Alliance does. These products are certified that not just do they adhere to the technical specifications, but also they test to be proven to be interoperable, right? So a FIDO2 server will work with a FIDO2 authenticator. And that really brings the benefits of open standards to agencies and organizations that choose to deploy FIDO certified solutions, right? So you can bring a best of breed solution that's future-proofed for future changes in the underlying technologies. So anyone who's looking to deploy FIDO, I'd encourage you to look for FIDO certified products and services. Secondly, a great data point, over 5 billion devices support FIDO, right? This represents basically every modern operating system and browser on the market. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And last but not least, we're seeing hundreds of millions of people using passwordless methods, including FIDO, to access services each month. And that 150 million plus, that actually just represents Microsoft account, right? So Microsoft recently announced that Microsoft account holders can ditch their passwords. But in addition to that, we're seeing many other organizations enable FIDO passwordless solutions for their consumers and for their employees. And ultimately, for FIDO to achieve our audacious goal of providing simpler, stronger authentication for all, we need to have endpoint support. This has been a focus of the Alliance since our inception, and we've collaborated with W3C and other groups to help address this need, which has led to the work with W3C and WebAuthn led to broad support for FIDO in every major modern web browser. Additionally, the fact that we have all of the major operating system vendors and device vendors as core stakeholders in FIDO, they've now built FIDO natively, native FIDO support into all their devices, right? So every modern Android, Windows, Apple device supports FIDO authentication. That means virtually every device being unboxed this very moment and throughout today and moving forward has built-in support for FIDO. And that really sets the stage for industry to move beyond passwords and adopt this phishing-resistant MFA at scale. And to that end, we are seeing broad adoption. This is a very small subset of the types of organizations that are deploying FIDO. It's meant to give you a feel for the breadth and depth of use cases and companies and geographies where FIDO is being deployed. Literally every sector and every region is deploying FIDO to secure citizen, enterprise, and government resources. So since this is a policy summit, I want to look a little bit closer at FIDO's imperative in government and where we fit therein. I think the government imperative in many ways is similar to that of industry, but there's also some distinct requirements. And Eric touched on some of those as he talked about the zero trust strategy from OMB. But at a high level, one imperative is to protect accounts for citizens and employees. Right? Fundamentally, this is the weakness of passwords and knowledge-based authentication, and the strength of FIDO's approach. Right? Finding a way to secure these accounts from remote attacks. Secondly, we need to create simpler sign-in experiences. Eric talked about the availability of platform authenticators, and that certainly is a simpler approach to logging into things. Again, using the device that's in your hand. But also, this should probably be expanded to say simpler and inclusive sign-in experiences. It's very interesting listening to some of the sessions yesterday, understanding that the breadth of requirements that, say, the federal government needs to consider when you think about people accessing government services. Citizens accessing government services can come from anything from a modern PC onto like a shared terminal in a library. And so this needs to be considered also as you think about, how do you leverage these modern standards to, help secure access to online services. Then lastly, it's important to enable trust in the broader government ecosystem. I think that trust is often overlooked when it comes to authentication, but ultimately it's a core element for all constituents, whether that's employees or citizens, agencies, partners, suppliers. They need to have confidence in the integrity of the systems that they're depending on. whether it's a matter of accessing your personal records or enabling requisition. Trust needs to be there, and trust ultimately is enforced through better security and authentication hygiene and best practices. Another thing that's interesting about FIDO and government is that it really brings a new paradigm for user authentication. It's great to hear Eric talk about the need to make fundamental change and not to be stuck in our past ways. And I think that's really the mindset that everyone needs to take when you're thinking about how to keep ahead of the hackers and how to deploy modern authentication. FIDO offers this, right? We offer newer, better options for strong authentication, but frankly speaking, governments have had to update some policies to support the ways in which FIDO is different. Ultimately, as technology evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. And sometimes there's kind of a lag time between those things happening. But it's been great to see so many different government bodies actually focusing closely on digital identity and authentication, updating policies accordingly to modernize systems, modernize regulations to better protect society at large. And to wit, when FIDO started engaging with governments back in 2015, most governments had not heard of FIDO. And in fact, many were just implementing or finalizing even regulations that were, very focused on OTP or PKI, right? And that was the kind of traditional way of thinking about authentication, because that's really all that was out there. But as we fast forward to 2022, not only are more governments aware of FIDO, but they're actively driving conversation on the delineation between legacy MFA and phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And again, if there's one takeaway from this talk, I hope you all take, is that that's the line that we all need to draw, the difference between legacy MFA and modern phishing-resistant MFA. I should note, that a lot of our progress here is thanks to the good work that Venable has done. So thanks to the Venable team for helping drive some of this awareness. And as a result, we're seeing a growing trend of government recognition of FIDO authentication. Right, it's often cited in government guidance documents, as Eric talked about earlier, and others will speak to you later today. Outside the U.S., we see groups like the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the UK Government Digital Service and Cabinet Office explicitly recommending utilization of FIDO security keys. We see great progress also in parts of Asia, such as Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, all citing FIDO as kind of core to their approach for agency and user authentication. In general, I think identity is coming to the fore in government. I love this first image there you see in the top left, back from April 2019, but identity is now seen as critical infrastructure. So there's digital identity right alongside things like the nation's power grid, right? So it's great to see the federal government recognizing the importance of digital identity to our nation's security. You also see the CISA references, and here we see the Biden executive order on multi-factor authentication. A lot of stuff's happening here in the U.S., but also outside the U.S. There are critical identity initiatives also taking place, including EIDAS and national identity wallets in Europe. So identity, digital identity in government continues to be a focus area and will be even more so as we move forward over the next couple of years. And we're thrilled to see this guidance, on multi-factor authentication from CISA just last week, I believe. FIDO security keys were cited as the gold standard of multi-factor authentication, and of course, we couldn't agree more. FIDO security keys, inside enterprise are perfect use to help protect sensitive resources. This is actually a good opportunity also to thank Jen Easterly and her team there for the work they're doing to protect this nation's infrastructure. So thank you. And then Eric talked at length about this, but for those of you who may be a little bit later joining, I see we have some new participants joining. Eric talked a lot about the OMB's focus on phishing resistance, but it's worth highlighting some of these aspects of the zero trust strategy. Specifically, the push on any phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication for agency workers, and also as an option for public users. And look, PIV and CAC are great and fully secure, of course, But the fact of the matter is that FIDO security keys from companies such as Yubico, OneSpan, Fatium, and many others, they present a lower friction option, ready to deploy option for agencies who are seeking to implement FIDO authentication in rapid fashion. So very thrilled to see this, and we think it opens up the opportunity for more agencies to protect their core constituents, and also for our stakeholders in the FIDO certified ecosystem to provide solutions to these agencies. So to start to wrap things up, I'd like to take a look at a few of FIDO's objectives. The first of which is to become part of the web's DNA. And this is an objective because it's necessary for our mission to become successful, right? Passwords are part of our lives because they're ubiquitous and they're part of the web's DNA. Simply put, we need to supplant them. We need to kick them out of that role and take their place. There are 3 steps that any technology need to take to achieve this goal of becoming part of the web's DNA. The first is industry standardization and collaboration, right? And this is part of FIDO's nature. So we're doing quite well there. We have so many stakeholders inside the organization, but also we're very keen and actively collaborate outside of FIDO Alliance, right? So we liaise with other standards groups like W3C, like OpenID Foundation, EMVCO, and many others to address adjacent use cases, to drive market education, and really to establish best practices in security, identity, and authentication. So that's a key component that we've taken to help become part of the web's DNA. A second key step is just to be shipping at scale. You need to be there. You need to have the dial tone effect where the technology is readily available to be consumed by end users and that service providers can count on when deploying a new technology. We talked about how basically every modern device, every modern browser supports FIDO authentication. And as we move into the realm of connected devices, we're also making inroads there through support for IoT, FIDO authentication IoT, as well as we look beyond just user authentication into device authentication. So critical to have the technology built into devices at scale, and we're doing quite well there. And lastly, it's important for a new technology to have strong regulatory and government embrace. And again, I think we've done quite well there for FIDO Alliance. So I've cited all sorts of government regulations, but really critical here is the fact that we actively engage with government bodies inside of FIDO Alliance as an organization, right? We have government members. We have a government deployment working group where government bodies come in and talk about their requirements, their use cases, and then collaborate to make sure that they can be addressed through FIDO specifications and our guidance outputs as well. So these are the key steps we need to take to become part of the web's DNA. We continue to focus on these and continue to make progress. And then once that's accomplished, our primary objective, of course, is to enable a phishing-resistant future. And here's what we need to do to get there. First, this might seem obvious, a statement, right? Replace password logins with biometrics and keys. But note, I say password logins, not passwords themselves, right? Because as Jeremy pointed out, it'll take some time to get rid of passwords. But we need to start with behavioral change. So, we did a UX study in 2021 and released some guidelines. And it was fascinating to see consumers' reactions to what ultimately is a more user-friendly solution, right? So using a biometric is much easier than trying to remember a complex password, but changing behavior isn't so easy. And so there's, these behavioral flows need to start now. The good news is that things like Touch ID, Face ID, and Android fingerprint and Windows Hello have proven that authentication technology can be consumerized. When Touch ID first came out, a lot of people questioned its utility, but suddenly they saw the convenience of using Touch ID to unlock their phone. And soon that action they took to unlock their phone allowed them to download an app and access that app. And then soon after that, it allowed them to log into websites and authorize transactions. All right, so it's been proven that a biometric, a single gesture login action can work. And I think that behavior is going to be critical as on the back end, we work to actually replace passwords with FIDO key pairs. The second key step, and this is a big one, is to stop depending on knowledge-based factors for account creation. So FIDO is doing some really important work. In fact, perhaps our most important work to standardize identity verification flows. And Ray Rivera will talk about the certification aspects of this shortly. But ultimately, we need to stop relying on knowledge-based factors for account creation, as that is also what will be the fallback for account recovery. And as long as there's knowledge-based proofs for account recovery, there's a wide open backdoor for hackers to walk through and take over accounts. So we really want to match our commitment to possession-based authentication with a commitment to possession-based identity proofing and verification. And then at that point, we're really in position to replace passwords with FIDO key pairs. In fact, the second step isn't a necessary step, but it'll certainly help a lot. But that's where we want to get to. All right. So when an account is created, there's not a knowledge-based factor to create the account. There's not a knowledge-based factor to secure the account. And when it comes time to recover the account, again, there's an inherence factor or something about the individual that allows them to safely recover that account without relying on shared secrets. Additionally, earlier or last year, Apple talked at their Worldwide Developer Conference, introduced the concept of something called pass keys, which basically promises to sync FIDO key pairs across iCloud, similar to how iCloud Keychain secures passwords today. So promising to offer a password manager-like experience, but instead of having passwords on a server, you have FIDO key pairs, public keys on the server, private keys on the device. And so I think that sort of innovation, that sort of commitment will rapidly lead to protecting not just workers in the enterprise, but also consumers at scale. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time today. I know I'm just about at time, but Jeremy, I'd be happy to take any questions that we have time to handle. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think the one question that came up from somebody with this was some confusion around, is a passwordless solution with FIDO, not single factor. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how FIDO is deployed only to support multi-factor in these use cases.
Yeah, so FIDO inherently is a multi-factor authentication flow, right? So you're in possession of your device and you're proving, that you're verifying yourself to the device as well if you're using a biometric. If you're using a security key, again, it's possession and inherence. And so I think FIDO fundamentally is a multi-factor. It meets MFA requirements through a single gesture. And in fact, if you cross the pond over to Europe, as we look at a lot of SCA requirements from PSC2, we feel like FIDO again, uniquely addresses that, through a simple gesture rather than depending on an OTP code as a second factor.
Great, thanks. I know there are a couple other questions in the queue, but I think as they came in, you addressed some of them. More to the point, we want to keep things moving and on time. So let me say, Andrew, thanks. Really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us today. And from here, we're going to shift right into a panel that I think is going to build a lot on what both Eric and Andrew had to talk about, a panel on how government and industry are rethinking authentication. So